what struck me is the very tangible evidence of how the Wall Street notion, Wall Street invested in Main Street, and how we do see examples of that, sponsorship agreements, but there is this class distinction and separation in how Main Street, Wall Street and Main Street operate, and there is not, there's a disconnect. There's been a disconnect that has been exacerbated through Great Depressions and recessions, but I think that what is clear looking at America from post-war to now is that finance was not viewed as concentrated wealth in the hands of a select few. And it was finance along with mobility that could provide for the livelihoods of the most number of Americans. And so when did that disconnect, when did it really fall apart in your estimation? If you think about both financial and government intervention that was designed to level the playing field to an extent within, as FDR said, save capitalism from itself. And so when did we, if there was ever a moment that the chips started falling, to what do you attribute that?
Yeah. There are a lot of different dimensions to this. A lot of people cite the birth of the career of Walter Wriston, where banking went to be from being boring and everybody was on the golf course at 3 o'clock to be entrepreneurial, looking for a high rate of return on equity. Others would date it, and there's a wonderful essay, I can't remember where it was published, it's no longer, Michael Lewis sat down with John Gutfreund from Salomon Brothers. And Gutfreund talked about where he thought things came unhinged is when all of the big banks went public, the big investment banks, went public, so you started playing with other people's money, so that the propensity to take risk accelerated. The third thing I would say is the Reagan era, and I don't mean right from the outset, because they had appointed Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was a compartmental finance guy, still is. Yeah. And the transition from Volcker to Greenspan, and I'm not picking on Alan Greenspan, but that was about going to more deregulation, getting rid of the Glass-Steagall Act and other things. A financial approach, and what was it Alan Greenspan famously said to Brooks Lee Bourne, who ran the Commodities Future Trading Commission, I don't believe in fraud. Well, he changed his mind. But there was a sense in which there was a faith that was cultivated. And you can look at the intellectual antecedents from this Mount Pelerin Society and the Chicago School and others that bring you to a place where everything the government does to restrain finance is considered an inefficiency, and that finance will be efficient and will govern itself. So whether these things are right or wrong, it was a changing of the guard. It led to more and more deregulation, less and less enforcement of regulations, and how would I say, and the frequency with which we have had financial crises around the world has gone way up. And I go to Shanghai next month, and I'm going to give a talk, and I'm going to say to them, if I was reading a novel right now, and I'm in the middle of it, and the protagonists are in a romantic partnership, and the man is the global capital markets, and the woman is China, I'm going to ask this woman, why would you ever marry this man? Given what you know of the LDC debt crisis, the savings and loan crisis, the Mexican bailouts, the Asian crisis, the Russian crisis, the dot-com bubble, the great financial crisis. How come you want to pair up with that tornado? And for the development of a 1.2 billion person economy,
trying to precipitate a war.
No, I'm asking a question. I kid. My punchline, by the way, on that speech, so I don't get too far off, is that they are not in a position to integrate internationally yet because of the maturity and the experience of their domestic financial structures cannot weather the tornadoes that come in. I once wanted to be a yacht designer. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a naval architect. And I know that naval architects do not envision Saturday night with the sun beautifully on the horizon, drinking a gin and tonic with a beautiful person on your arm. That's not what you build a boat for. You build it for tsunamis and typhoons. And so they got to go build financial markets for tsunamis and typhoons. Then they can link up with those of us who generate them. And but the Chinese officials, they're not that far off from me. When I talk with them, they say, you blew us up in the 1990s, you blew yourself up in 2008. This is not a model we think we can emulate. So you look at their stock market, it's, how they say, more volatile than ours. So, but I think that reflects the immaturity of structure.
When you think of democracy and finance and the top-down model that seems to be implemented in both instances with a public, sort of a public market that really, we think of publicly traded companies, and now the present administration as kind of governing from a top-down approach. Is that accurate? And I mean, if you have both an economic and political administration that does have either a top-down tendencies or even an authoritarian orientation, isn't that problematic in the preservation of democracy?
Yeah. I think we're in a really tender and dangerous place. When I started this Institute for New Economic Thinking, I said that I had two myths that I had to challenge. One was that unfettered free markets will govern themselves, and the other is the romance that whenever something breaks down, government will fix it. And you have people on the left who just romanticize government, and you have people on the right who romanticize markets. And you mentioned earlier, and I want to loop back because I'm taking notes from everything that you said about Wall Street and Main Street. We do need financial markets. And the way this stuff is all sold, financial markets, non-financial corporation, everything else, these institutions are sold as means to an end, and the end is prosperity and well-being. And what people are asking questions about now after the 2008 crisis, which I do not think was a financial crisis, it was a crisis in government legitimacy, which is much broader. It applies to everything. On the left and the right, people are skeptical of government now. And that cripples our capacity to react to certain things. But with regard to democracy and finance, in that kind of sense of how things are sold, capitalism gets its moral license from being governed by democracy. But when capitalism doesn't function well and people are traumatized, they despair, they panic, they become inflamed and enraged, and they become what I'll call subject to demagoguery. The best book I've ever seen on this is the famous management theorist Peter Drucker, who wrote a book about 6 years before he became a famous management theorist about the 1930s in Austria and Germany. It's called The End of Economic Man. And it's about the disintegration in the faith in any form of social order in Austria and Germany. And we obviously had dreadful results from that. And so what I'm concerned about when I say this is a very dangerous time is that when people are filled with fear, on the verge of panic and despair, when we see things like opioid addiction and so forth that are so widespread, and we're not talking about 4% of the population, we're talking about much larger numbers, can democracy function well? Because obviously a more representative democracy, I'm thinking like an engineer now, creates a feedback system where you learn from it. But if the people are frightened and terrified and subject to demagogic and authoritarian rule, it doesn't work very well. And I think the danger right now is that Trump went out and made a lot of promises to people. I always laugh because in the old days with currencies, they talk about dual currencies like South Africa. We have a dual currency political system. It's ruled by money and it's ruled by votes. And we got to the place where money did such a good job of pulling everything in its own direction that it frightened everybody else. And now votes have reacted. And a lot of people are afraid of democracy now because they see this as an inflamed, raging democracy, not a rational, representative democracy. And the danger of Trump right now, because he's under a lot of pressure and he's being challenged every day on every front, is that he becomes more authoritarian. He manufactures like foreign crises. And his economic policy seems to be being forced so as not to get impeached into the hands of a far-right House of Representatives. And their agenda, which has been very much dictated by what I'll call plutocratic feudalism, is not delivering the goods to the people Trump made promises to. So these despairing people are now in a place where they might feel hoodwinked, but if they feel hoodwinked, what do? Do they deny it, what they call cognitive dissonance, and stay with Trump, let him become more authoritarian, worsen their condition? Or do they do something else, which is a healthy alternative? Well, any of you that are reading Politico and everything else, watching the Democratic Party carve itself up right now, are not seeing a healthy representative alternative emerging that would, what you might call, make me want to get off the Trump train if I had gotten on in despair. You can't jump back into despair. You have to jump towards something that's healthy.
What would that healthy alternative look like? It's not out there yet.
Well, I think people are looking for a change in the balance between corporate and what I'll call plutocratic power. When you see things...
That doesn't mean if you come from the current crop of U.S. senators
if they
or governors,
chose to create... but for instance, I'm from Michigan, as I mentioned. Looking at the education secretary now, just ripping apart public schools. I watched the Detroit bankruptcy. I was very involved in it as a kind of commentator, consultant, and what have you. And all of a sudden in Detroit, the budget's turned over from the city to the state by the emergency manager, and the state enacts things which allow new private schools to use the public school budget. Now you can say, okay, public schools were inefficient, etc. But they put in things in the law that says you get your money regardless of the scale of enrollment, and you get your money and we don't test you for the performance of the school. Now, campaign contributions produced those amendments and gave people windfalls that started private schools in Detroit. A group from called Credo from Stanford snuck in and did all kinds of tests. And they are those private schools are underperforming the public schools in Detroit. So you're asking me what to look at? People who felt like my retirement, my health care is getting cheaper and more reliable, I'm not having to negotiate with insurance companies whether they cover me after I've been paying premiums. You got to weaken the role of medical insurance companies vis-a-vis the population. Once you pay your premium, you're covered. Now, you can say there are people trying to commit fraud, and that's probably true. But there are a whole lot of games that are being played in medical insurance that are scaring people. One of my friends said, I pay insurance premiums in medicine for the right to sue to find out if I'm covered, not to be covered. And that extra dimension of the process is dangerous. The education system is getting worse. Law enforcement is getting stronger. What is it they say in California now? The incarceration budget is bigger than the education budget of the state. These things are not healthy symptoms.
Right.
So,
well, if you were to look at...
But you got to get out from under it.
Right.
Money politics. The Democratic Party in California is supported by the prison guards and fortifies that dysfunction that I just underscored.